All right, hello everybody. My name is Julian Tait. I'm one of the co-founders of Open Data Manchester, which is a group of people who are interested in making data available for the businesses, citizens, and also the public organisations of Greater Manchester in the UK. Originally, it was part of what was called the Open Data Cities programme. I used to be head of innovation projects for Future Everything, which is traditionally known as being a festival, but it's also a kind of a living lab that's based around experiential opportunities, allowing to prototype different technologies and different ways of working within the city of Manchester. The lab allows you to kind of almost take a low-risk approach to trying to implement new ways of working, so whether that being through citizen sensors, crowdsourcing data, bringing together arts into the actual design process, into service design. And so it creates an environment for cross-collaborations in many ways. It's also became the umbrella for the programme of work, which was mainly concentrated on open data, that started in 2009. So 2009, about May 2009, was quite an important time in the UK as far as open data was concerned. It was when the idea of the data.gov.uk, which is the national data store, started being discussed. There was a famous dinner meeting apparently between Tim Berners-Lee and Gordon Brown, who was the Prime Minister at the time, who said open data would be a good idea, and they tried to push it through. So this was when the time when we started thinking, well, how could open data benefit everybody within Manchester? And through this, Open Data Manchester came about, which is what I still am involved with, Data GM, the Greater Manchester Data Store, and another project called GMDSP, which is the Greater Manchester Data Synchronisation Programme. If ever there was a public sector sounding programme, that one is. That's the one you can't pronounce. So the whole idea of open data within Greater Manchester came about through a kind of question, really, as is kind of, if we could make the data open for everybody, all the data that was held within public organisations and also within some private organisations, would our city, which has huge inequalities within it, our post-industrial city, develop differently? Would there still be the same asymmetries that we see? Would people's access to information allow them to help themselves, to pull themselves out of the situations they were in, and to become, and kind of bring on a more kind of knowledge-based interactions and knowledge-based economy? So we thought that this, by doing this, would create several benefits, and a lot of these are well known by anybody who works within open data. I mean, it's this notion of the data that public bodies hold is far beyond, is underutilised generally. It's used for the purposes of that particular function, and then it is tend to be hidden and siloed and hidden away. Whereas that data kind of brought together with other types of information and other types of knowledge can actually create greater value. It's often said that the data that you hold can be used for higher purpose than the data it was created. Importantly, we thought that the data would help re-enfranchise the citizenry of Greater Manchester. This is really important at the moment because obviously the elections are going on today, and I will try and get back so I can vote. The city centre constituency, Manchester Central, the representative, the Labour representative, got voted into Parliament with an 18% vote turnout. And as a democratic mandate, that's appalling. And that has real implications with regards of governing not only the country, but also governing the city, because people don't engage if they think, well, we didn't vote, it's not for us, we don't have any part in this process of how our city develops. Obviously, you hear about greater accountability and also the savings through efficiency. So when you start looking at the way that our cities function and how our administrations function, you notice that there's many times the same things are going on within different departments that just don't actually talk to each other. There is no horizontal flow of information generally. They're very, very vertically siloed organisations. And therefore there is a huge potential for savings through efficiency, which is extremely important at these kind of times of fiscal stress. And also what we found that as soon as you start to release data, you're actually starting a conversation of co-design and collaboration. What you're doing is saying, this is what we have, this is what we do with it. We don't know the full potential of what we can do with it. How can you help us to do things? How can you help us to do things better? How can you help us to find new ways of doing things that will benefit for all of us? So at the time, there wasn't really that much happening in Europe. There were a lot of organisations that were talking about open data as trying to push hard for opening up of data. We started looking towards North America. This was a poster child, or still is a poster child of open data, Oakland crime spotting. What's quite interesting about this is that if you go on it now, the last crime that was reported on this site was in 2013. So this poster child of open data, this Oakland crime spotting map, seems to just be hanging there. And we don't know why, because sometimes things seem like a good idea at a particular point in time, and then they become neglected. I mean, that needs more. It might just be a fault of the website, but when I was looking over the last few weeks, it seems to be static. But what we saw within North America was this idea that we can't do this alone. Cities were saying we can't actually deliver the services alone. We need to re-enfranchise our citizenry. Vancouver was a great example of this. There was an open data evangelist called David Eves, but even more importantly, there was a woman called Angela Reamer, who's a Green Party, I think she's Deputy Mayor of Vancouver now, who's promoting the use of open data to help the communities engage with the processes of government, to make them feel as though they had a stake and were able to participate. So we were looking very much to America for that. So the challenge within Greater Manchester was Manchester's only got a population of 500,000 people, but the city itself is much larger. It's 2.7 million people. Because I think what we tend to think of when we talk to cities, they always have a very kind of defined administrative geography, and policies and services are delivered within these tight geographical boundaries. So we thought, well, we are citizens of Greater Manchester. I live in Manchester. I dump my rubbish in Trafford. I mean, I go to a recycling facility, of course, not just shovel it over the border. And likewise around Greater Manchester, people kind of in Salford, it's known that they will go for their emergency healthcare in Bolton, and the cities aren't actually built for doing that. They want you to all be contained within those particular areas. But this creates a challenge, because not only are you trying to deal with one democratically elected entity, you're trying to deal with 10 democratically elected entities, all with their own personalities, all with their own uniqueness, and all with their own kind of ways of, and slightly strange ways of delivering service. But they're all trying to do the best for their citizens. So it was kind of a challenge, especially as we weren't actually a government organisation. So we were a citizen-led group. We felt that this needed to be done. There was the Future Everything Festival that was there to kind of promote what we were doing. So we were kind of talking about this notion of the conceptual over the administrative city. And what also we kind of realised when you talk about this whole city is that if you're trying to get people to engage with an emergent practice, such as using open data, you've got to think about, well, what is the return on investment? So in Greater Manchester, well, in Manchester, say you've got 500,000 citizens, there's a potential for a proportion of those to use your service. But if you have a kind of functioning conceptual city of 2.7 million, you can see there's potential for the economics of scale start to kick in. And this led into another project, which I'm not going to talk about, which was a European project about how can we build similar systems across European cities so we can actually create a greater scale and so create greater economic activity. But also what we found is that a lot of problems within administrative boundaries are actually because symptomatic of problems in other boroughs. And so what you get is this kind of inefficient service delivery because there may be an area of deprivation on the border of one borough and that might be impacting on another borough. And traditionally, I think that administrative model doesn't necessarily capture those. And also it's this notion of people see the city as Manchester. It has different kind of towns and boroughs, but they see it as one kind of organic thing, really. And as I said, Greater Manchester doesn't work like that. It's all kind of delivered. There are pan-GIB Greater Manchester bodies, but they tend to all kind of like to keep their own little administrative silos going. So it was a grand challenge. So as an outside organisation, how did we kind of go about creating this environment for change? And what was apparent at that particular time, with a lot of the open data movement, it was just about give us the data, give us the data, give us the data, which was a very, very antagonistic way of trying to build something which was essentially supposed to be collaborative. And so what we started to do was talk to people about what are the difficulties that you have, what are the difficulties you face, what are the challenges that you perceive that you need to overcome. And we were in at a time of huge austerity. There was 24% funding cut through the comprehensive spending review, and the public sector is being decimated, well, especially in the north. And so to try and encourage these organisations to innovate out of a crisis is really, really difficult, because basically what you're doing is putting more risk into a very risky situation. And so it's kind of a process of hand-holding. We had to try and get funding. Future Everything got funding to kind of start to develop these through an innovation investment fund that was through Nesta and all the local authorities, very small amounts of money. And we started to have these conversations, trying to allow them to understand that by sharing data, you can actually start to maybe develop services, and maybe you can create services or continue services more effectively. And what it also allows you to do is start having these conversations with citizens, start having these conversations outside your local authority with interested parties who want to help you. So, Open Data Manchester. This is why Open Data Manchester came about. We had to create that demand-side argument for data. Us going along and saying, just give us the data and people will use it, didn't work. People want to know, well, who will use this data? Where are these people who you say will come and start to develop us, to give us insight, help us deliver the services? So in early 2010, Open Data Manchester came about. It was a fully inclusive and independent community. It had city officials in it, it had academics, it had activists, artists, journalists, anybody who was interested could be part of it. It was both critical and it was also a friend. And it allowed some of the local authorities to come along and say, this is what we're trying to do. What data would you like to have that can help you do what you want to do and ultimately help us? And through that, there was businesses who were involved, who were developing kind of linked data stores. There were projects such as open allotment data, which was kind of got quite a bit of press within the UK, about people accessing or finding places of land where they could grow produce on, which is a big thing in the UK at the moment. And so lots of things started to develop out of that, and these conversations started to happen. Also, through those conversations, the Transport Authority, Transport for Greater Manchester, released its data to Open Data Manchester. This was the first time it was done in the UK. All their scheduling data, all the positions of their bus stops. There was a bit of a hoo-ha about it, in the sense that there was certain organisations saying, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to release this data, there are various licensing restrictions. But we got these huge 100-megabyte data dumps. We didn't know what to do with it at that particular time. It was kind of, what do you do with all this data? We haven't got a data store. But it started to create momentum, and it started to create a logic within some of these organisations. Within the local authorities themselves, what we noticed, as I said, they're very, very siloed communities. But we did start to, through starting these conversations, identify kind of horizontal communities of practice. So even though people in Manchester generally had a line management structure that was highly vertical, highly hierarchical, there were these communities of practice that ran across the region. And what was interesting, and it came about actually through talking to transport people, was that transport people only like talking to transport people. I thought, oh yeah, but I bet they don't. Just, oh yes, they do. They all like their train sets. They all have train sets? Apparently not. But it was this notion that if I've got a problem that's distinct to a particular kind of function, then the only people who can really relate to my problem is somebody else who has who is in that position in another local authority. So what we started to do was start to arrange events around planning, open planning. And we started talking to the freedom of information people, who are often neglected group of people who feel like all they're doing is having to service the freedom of information requests that come into their local authorities. They have to see whether they fit a certain format or whether they can be answered or not answered. But who were really understood what this data was about and the need and what was legally, what legally you should be doing within local authorities. So they were great. We got a lot of support through that. And as I said, planning and policy improvement. Policy improvement was quite interesting because obviously that's to do with change within the organisations, but also the need. There was an understanding there was a need to share data across different organisations. So it was about identifying, borrowing the language, talking to people, understanding their needs, and also trying to create communities of practice that were across the authority. Oh, sorry, wrong computer. I've got two computers. I was trying to doing several presentations. What I need to say, though, at that particular point in time, and it's really important to kind of take note of, is about the politics of open data. So when we started doing Open Data Manchester, it was kind of the end of the Labour government, right? And then it suddenly became then we came into the coalition government. And all of a sudden, open data became politicised. Open data became part of what was called a transparency agenda. And in the north, well, in a lot of cities, this was seen as open data and transparency as a means and a mechanism to downsize the public sector. So the conversations, which started to be quite open and quite informed and intelligent and collaborative, started to become quite politicised. So we have one of the local authorities in Chambers said, we will not do open data. They saw that there was a Labour authority. They saw it as being a Tory agenda that was to do with stripping out public sector services, public sector jobs. I mean, there is transparency is an incredibly important part of this, but I think the way that it became politicised wasn't helpful. And I was at an open data meeting last week where there's all the local authorities, and they said it's probably the single most unhelpful thing that happened with regards to the open data agenda within the UK is that when it suddenly became focused on transparency, it meant that everybody went into a tailspin, and they weren't having that kind of informed debate about open data. So, data gem. So data gem kind of was the logical conclusion of the data releases that started to happen with through Open Data Manchester. It was a partnership between Future Everything and Trafford Council. Trafford Council, interestingly enough, within the kind of Labour heartland of Greater Manchester of the North, Trafford is a Tory council, which created problems because everybody thought, oh, you're telling us it's not a Tory agenda, how come you're partnering with a Tory council? Because they just saw the benefits of doing this. But we created DataGem. It took 3 months from start to launch, which was fantastic. So it's a CCAN-based data store that's supposed to cover all of Greater Manchester. The Transport Agency puts its data in. Open Data Manchester was putting data in. And there's a lot of national data subsets from data. Trafford was putting data in, and some of the other partners started putting data in. The 3 months from start to launch was a blessing, and was also I think was a little bit of a shackle round our necks, in that a lot of the people who we tried to get on board, tried to become part of the collaborative process within the city, thought we were just taking decisions without them, because the public sector has a pace that it likes to do. So traditionally, a project like this would take 2 years. It'll be about a 6-month procurement process. Even though it didn't cost very much, it was really, really cheap. And there'll be all this negotiation, who does this, who does that. But it took 3 months. It was great because it was there. It was based on CCAN, which was also a slightly political decision because data.gov.uk was a CCAN system. So we thought, well, if it looks as though it's kind of, we're using the same technology, it should be good. I mean, CCAN is one of the systems. There are other providers, I have to say. And it kind of worked. It kind of worked. And basically, there were, as I said, there were public sector organisations and also voluntary sector organisations. And when we're talking about this kind of creation of a demand side and supply side case for Greater Manchester, we were talking about, underneath it all, we were trying to think of a kind of ecology, of self-sustaining ecology. One of the problems I think that a lot of people have found with open data is that there's a lot of kind of, let's publish it once and then just forget about it. We published our open data and yeah, everybody else can do their thing. And we had to create this kind of ongoing conversation between the data providers who would provide data through data GM, the community who would make things out of it, and the press were really important. There's a lot of, one of the biggest intermediaries with data is actually the press, we find. Within Manchester, Manchester Evening News does a lot of data-driven journalism. And actually their umbrella, well, they're a part of a news group called Trinity Mirror, and they have data scientists and data analysts. A lot of their stories are derived from open data and also freedom of information requests. So they're incredibly important to have on board because they were the people who actually allowed most people to engage with the data that was being released. But it was this whole idea that we're all doing it together, it's supposed to create a healthy ecosystem, and in a way it has done. So we have events that go on, we're getting applications and services developed. Not as many and not perhaps as sparkly as what you're doing with Dublinked, but they are there, and it's interesting where things are starting to turn up. So with transport data, there's things being integrated into Garmin, satellite navigation products, City Mapper, which is a really nice way of navigating the city, integrates the data that's being produced, and there's various other applications and services. But it was this notion of how do you create feedback within the system. Governance was incredibly important when dealing with this. And this was my first kind of dealing with how do governance structures work within local authorities. So we had the lead partners who were funded to do this with Craft and Future Everything. And then we had the 10 local authorities who were on board. And you think that if you've got people nominated to be on a board, you think, right, everybody's going to be in step, everybody's going to be doing it together. But what you can find that people are sometimes nominated to a board to slow the process up. And so we kind of, which is a new one to me, so you're here to help this go forward, but actually what you're doing is you're slowing the whole process, and it was quite interesting. And some of the discussions, stroke arguments, were very kind of telling in that some people were saying, right, I'm here, but I'm making decisions, and I don't know whether I'm going to have a job next month. I mean, they were kind of some of the discussions that were going on because we're obviously in financial austerity. But it was a way of trying to get everybody to be included in the process of how do we get this Greater Manchester data store moving along. There were more proactive people. There was Manchester, Trafford, Salford, who are the largest kind of boroughs within the city. But it didn't take everybody along. Transport for Greater Manchester were great. The transit agency, the fire service were stars. They were just kind of, yep, here's data, what's the problem? And also it was kind of the outside community was on it as well. What we didn't realise, and I'm sure all you involved with public data is that a lot of data is not very good. That is actually the data that was given to us, transport data, and it was in such an arcane format that you had to have some kind of prior knowledge. It came out of some systems that were probably developed in the 1980s. And you really had to kind of unpick it and try to understand why this is this, why this is this. Transport planning is incredibly complex, and I can't really begin to understand it. But what was apparent is that lots of data is held in different systems. Some local authorities had multiple GIS systems. I think one that I know of had, in one department, had 18 GIS systems. And so the data was incoherent. The data was, let's say, abused. But what you find is the data takes on the personality of the people who enter the data. So we looked at some of the planning going back to the 1980s, and there was kind of 24 ways of saying no. And it was just a kind of, you just don't think, is that no or is that a yes? Oh, well, that's a kind of no. But and so it's kind of, how can you create new insight? How can you create new services when there is that incoherent, where it is so incoherent? And there's also this notion of different data sets describing the same thing differently. This is a huge problem within public service. So you might have a subject, a patient, you might have a citizen, you might have a service user. I mean, with public data, with private data, it's incredibly difficult. I remember going to a presentation by a CIO of a local authority who says, we've lost half our population. We just don't know where they are. I mean, they knew where they were physically because they knew they lived in houses, but in their data, they didn't know whether John Smith was J. Smith, was J. Smith. You know, it's that kind of, those kind of problems, and they're endemic within the data that's held. Proprietary formats, local authorities often didn't actually own the data that they created. Ordnance surveys is one of the big bugbears of that, where local authorities were creating the data that would be put into the the Ordnance Survey Master Map, which is kind of the base map of the UK, and they couldn't use that data freely. Well, they can now under agreements, but they can't then give it to somebody else to use freely. And also within certain systems, they weren't built for openness, so that was also problematic. And also what we found is there were people who kept data primarily so they kept their job. We found this in planning, where you found there were people who wouldn't even give the data to their own local authorities. It was as silly as that. We've been in situations where we've been talking to people who said, oh, perhaps you need to give a freedom of information request in for that, because they didn't feel that they could go and ask for that information because it was blocked to them. I mean, this is the crazy situation that we're in. So to try and deal with the whole kind of I suppose the messiness of the data came the Greater Manchester Synchronisation Programme, which was led by Future Everything, and it's still come to an end, and it's just come to an end. We had a meeting yesterday about it actually with Future Cities Catapult. So there's a hat tip to them, and Connected Digital Economy Catapult. What it tried to do was, how do you overcome these types of problems you find within the public sector? And it was all about creating linked data depositories, because we realised that even though all these different kind of data repositories were trying to describe the same thing, we had to use some mechanism that we could actually link them together. So linked data was incredibly important within that. Using a company called Swirl, who are very active within Open Data Manchester, because they're Manchester-based. They do stuff for Department of Communities and Local Government, Scottish Government, and various other local authorities. And it was really good to have them on board, trying to kind of understand how to kind of model data. But importantly around this, we had what was called a Code Fellow program. The Code Fellow idea came from Code for America. And it was this notion of how to get people who are civic-minded developers, early-stage developers, to work with local authorities to enable them to do things that they perhaps wouldn't be able to do. So the program was all about this kind of modelling data, which is incredibly technical. But what we found within the local authorities themselves, they didn't have the capacities to do that themselves. So we created a Code Fellow program, which brought people in. They had to be civic-minded developers. So we weren't bringing in consultants. It was important that they weren't consultancies, because we didn't want to have that consultancy relationship. It was about people who wanted to do it. They got paid, but they got paid below a market rate. It was decent pay, but it was below a market rate. And what their job there was to do was to work across the local authorities with the other Code Fellows, but also to transfer skills and knowledge about how to create these kind of linked data, how to model linked data to the local authorities so that they'll be able to carry on doing that for themselves. The programme, as I say, has just come to an end, but it has actually created an environment where both Data GM and Greater Manchester Synchronisation Programme, which kind of is there to try and solve some of the problems we've found with data GM, are potentially going to align. So it's got another year of funding, and I think the future is rosy with regards to that. I want to come back to governance again just briefly, because I've got a minute left. It's horrible. I drew this in Google Docs, and the salmon pink and yellow doesn't really look very nice, I'm afraid. So apologies for that. I'm not really a graphic designer. If anybody wants to talk to me about this structure, I'd be happy to do. But governance was important, working within local authorities. How do you get people to work together, feel as though they've got ownership, but try and create this kind of vertical kind of, I suppose, intent with this kind of collaborative horizontal. So we had co-fellows working with LA leads, local authority leads, who were there to kind of work in partnership with each other, who all came together across the kind of local authorities to work on similar problems. And we had kind of co-fellow kind of development. We had a technical co-fellow who could give more, who could kind of work around problems for the co-fellows themselves. And we had the future everything was at the top of that, and we tapped into a wider community. This one thing that Open Data Manchester and myself personally are interested in for the future now, looking at how kind of the Greater Manchester Data Store worked and the governance structure worked in certain ways and didn't in others, how this worked for a very specific application. It was spread out to all 10 local authorities in the end, is data is actually very complex, and people need to have trust in what you're going to do with the data and how it's going to be looked after, to do with the provenance, and also, I suppose it's done with, data is being produced and utilised with the best intent. And so what Open Data Manchester is doing at the moment, what I've been doing, is looking at how can cooperative models of data governance start to exist, which gives a really interesting, offers a really interesting kind of future. So if you've got all data owners being in a cooperative with equal say, you can perhaps create a more collaborative environment for data sharing, and also with personal data as well. If you have people who are also part of that cooperative, it offers a potential. So not only can you create open data and release it, but also allow the citizens to give their data to the organisation to create, enrich and create greater context. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Julian. Some of those issues there with messy data and the challenges of working across organisations really resonate with us here. We have a couple of minutes for questions. Yeah?
What I want to say just relates back to the administrative angle. And I was very interested in what you said about the horizontal communities and getting the guys to talk to one another in particular areas. There were people, I'm out of administration for a while, but there were two things that interested me way back. One was the introduction of freedom of information as an administrative thing. And then that got so onerous on people that I think it led to an incentive to actually publish a whole load of stuff so that you cut down on the work that was needed to service the freedom of information. That was one area. The other angle was there was a huge proliferation of people setting up their own little systems. I think you've mentioned that sort of thing within organisations. I mean, I had systems of my own within my own sections that weren't really integrated into the network at all. And it seems to me that in doing this sort of thing, you're revealing this sort of stuff. And I'm wondering, to what extent are you aware of a feedback or a sort of a biofeedback from what you're doing into the administrative organisation that's providing the stuff? In other words, are you influencing the thing backwards and making the administrative areas more efficient, as opposed to just sort of reconciling your data and tweaking it and that sort of stuff? Thanks.
I think what happened was this kind of realisation of how data is kept within the organisations themselves. I think within the UK there have been years of e-government, e-government reforms, and that has shown up lots of logjams within the system. What we found was there was because this is also I suppose, seen to be best practice as at the moment, what you were getting was a desire by the local authorities themselves, the active local authorities, to be seen, to be acknowledging and overcoming some of these difficulties. So it's this notion of how you will create an environment where you don't get these little silos starting to exist. I think that what we still find and still exist is you get these little kind of I suppose little seats of power which revolve around these data, and planning is a particularly difficult one. But I think there is this is something that has to come from leadership as well, because what we found was you can go in the middle and you start talking to people and they can understand, but it needs the leadership to actually tell people that, right, it's okay for you to do this. Because I think strong leadership is really important in that perspective. And I don't think you really get it very often. You definitely don't get somebody like a CIO, many CIOs in local government who have that, who can actually help people and make people understand those processes. So I think it is starting to happen by the people who want it to happen, but they're still kind of quite entrenched positions, and I think they're the difficult things we have to overcome in the future.
Thanks. I'll add to that from Dublink's point of view as well, because I think in the first year we came across something like over 70 different formats in one organisation, and also in the silos. We had feedback from senior IT people in some of our organisations that when we published on Dublinked, that they discovered information that they didn't know that their organisation had. But I think it's key, the points you made about open data can't be separate, like freedom of information can't be separate. It all needs to be embedded as part of proper knowledge management across organisations.
I think also, following on from that, the freedom of information is quite an interesting one, because it reveals a statutory right to data. So, and actually people have a lot of rights, but within certain administrations they try and bar access as much as they can. And with what we found, that there wasn't even this kind of, so what would happen, you get people trying to access information that should be in public domain. What was happening, that information was being released solely to the person who actually who wanted it. A lot of this was commercial information. There was non-domestic rates, historic non-domestic rates valuations, where money was perhaps needed to be paid back to the rate holder, and they didn't release the data to everybody, which would perhaps chill this whole kind of business focus. Because you're not creating competitive advantage for the person who actually just asks for the information, you're proactively disseminating it. And also there were the same things were happening all the time. And they reckon there's around about £250 was the cost, this was in 2008, for the cost for actually servicing a freedom of information request. And they're getting the same ones kind of week on week, and it's kind of, just release it.
Any other questions over here? There's
I'm interested in your coding fellows. To what extent was that driven by the citizen? Did you have an outreach program, or like how did you prioritize what data was going to be worked on or interpreted, and
right.
particularly app development?
Right. The Code Fellow program, because it was a technical program. It was to overcome some of the difficulties that we'd found when trying to get data released to Data GM, and it was that it wasn't comparable. You couldn't compare data. It was very difficult to use it from different authorities. So there wasn't that level of it wasn't citizen driven in that sense. It was about how do you change the systems, how do you create new knowledge to enable them so they can actually just start talking about the same things. So there wasn't within the Code Fellow program, but there are other initiatives that have been done, which have been more focused on the needs of end users, of citizens, and creating that co-design process, but not this particular Code Fellow program wasn't about that.
Another question? Over here.
Most of what we've seen this morning, the data sets are data sets created by the local authorities themselves or by key third parties. I appreciate the British system is different from the Irish. One of the questions I have is about the data and the information that's being provided by the citizenry to you, and any kind of complications in terms of getting that information, being able to use it for administrative rather than statistical purposes. We've obviously had a big issue here over the summer where we were setting up a new water utility company that's still, it's not a third party, but it's sort of public owned, and the use of citizen data in terms of that information. I'm just kind of wondering, what kind of challenges have you faced over there in the same kind of realm?
Right. Well, that's a challenge that's not been addressed yet, because that's not what we're doing. But that is something that we are actively looking at, because the data GM, as it stands, is a data store for anybody who holds data. At the moment, it's about public data, open data. So obviously, you can't have personal data or data that identifies an individual. But I mean, when I alluded to this with the kind of cooperative models, is that there is a potential to start creating a data GM plus, which allows that enrichment from citizens at the level that they want. What they say, well, we could allow this data to be used for certain things and not for other things. I mean, that's the whole governance processes have got to be worked out, but that has to happen. I think what happens with a lot of data is it's contextless. So you might see the physicality of something, you won't know the reasons why that something happens. And I think that's for any city-based data store, I think it has to, personally, I think it has to take into account that. And there is a lot of interest from the voluntary sector to be involved with that, and how can they help us in their data there, but we haven't actually crossed that bridge yet.
Well, if I can just kind of pass that question on to Paul, and obviously Dublin City Council and the other entities collect a lot of data from the citizenry as well, such as voter registration information, the property tax. So the Dublin City corporations obviously have collected a huge amount of data sets out there. Are there many data sets where you've been basically told this just simply can't be part of the project, even if it's anonymised, or any challenges there?
Yeah, and a lot of the data, I suppose because we're local service providers, a lot of it is operational. And we started with that operational data because we didn't come across those issues. Some of the data, even though it may be available under freedom of information, because you're making it available as open data, you actually have more stringent requirements. For example, we had to take all names of applicants out of our planning information data, even though that information is available to the public. Once you put it online, you're making it hyper-searchable. But yeah, there are certain areas whereby, for housing data, for instance, we've been looking at that over the years, but it's very difficult to find the right level of aggregation because there would be identifiable factors. So that kind of data would just have to be completely anonymised before we would publish it. Similarly, emergency call-outs, that kind of data. But I guess in terms of not just as open data, but there's a trade-off to be had in terms of how much data citizens will provide in return for more personalised services. So there's a conversation to be had there, and increasingly we're finding when services move online that people are actually entering their own data. So it's, you know, it's a challenge to be able to ensure that you do retain privacy, and we've developed scripts that we would run against our data sets that would look for common names, that kind of thing. But it is a challenge. I'm conscious that we've gone a little bit over time for break. If there's one more question, I might take it, but one more here.
Pauline, you mentioned the use of citizen data for air and noise monitoring. You touched on it very briefly. Just wondering how you ensure the robustness of that data, where you've got, I suppose, DCC has calibrated monitoring equipment versus people's perceptions, and how you ensure the robustness of citizen data within that. So, Pauline.
Yeah, well, I'll start with that, but you probably, the environmental monitoring and citizen sensing, it's true because people especially if they're using their mobile phones, sure, they might just leave it on and put it in their pocket, or, the environment can't be controlled. And a lot of that environmental data goes through very robust calibration before it would actually get published by as an official statistic. That particular one I showed was it was citizen observations. So it was about perception. If someone thought the noise was too loud, they would make a report. So it was an interesting distinction there. But it is an issue. As a lot more of this data comes in, it's maybe not verifiable. So it comes with a health warning.
I think that I find citizen monitoring really interesting. Having been involved with a couple of citizen monitoring projects, calibration is really difficult to do. Also, it's the notion of a lot of the official and standardised ways of monitoring pollution have been set up in such a way that you can compare across different stations, whereas it can be so ad hoc, citizen monitoring, where somebody who's got, say, a watch-based sensor is holding it, might be taking a measurement next to a road, which would not necessarily be a true relationship to a true picture of actually what pollution is like that. So the variation is very difficult to overcome, and I watch with interest as these projects become more mature, how that non-standardised information, or the non-standardised way of collecting it, not necessarily the way data is presented, is actually kind of modelled or used, because it is challenging.
Okay, thanks very much. We're going to break for coffee now, and it's up 2 flights of stairs. So when you come out here, you'll see the signs. You can go straight up to the first floor, and we'll have tea and coffee. And when you come back at 11:30, we'll have broken this room into 2, so you can make your choice. I want to thank Julian again very much. I think that quote that's going to stay with me is that data, like a dog, takes on the personality of its owner. But we welcome you back after your coffee break. Thanks very much.